Welcome back to Emergence, the podcast on business strategy, intentional leadership, and ESG, where I, Zoe Zeitler, share unique perspectives and insights to help you become a better leader or entrepreneur. Today's topic will be translators and bridge builders. Similar to the discourse around generalists, this is a special archetype of personality within working environments who has a unique but often overlooked skill set to offer. While the digital era has rapidly swept in the age of the knowledge economy, even while much of the corporate world is lagging behind in recognizing what this actually means for how organizations should be structured and who they should value, the knowledge economy is the economic system in which value is created primarily through information, expertise, and intellectual capability, rather than through physical production. We see a rapid growth of knowledge economy companies and workplaces in today's world. And this shift has already fundamentally changed which kinds of intelligence organizations need most. In the deep dive part of this episode, we'll look at organizational psychology research that shows us why so many translators go unrecognized in their workplaces and how organizational culture can be shifted to surface and leverage their contributions. We'll look at one of history's greatest translator achievements, the Human Genome Project, as a case study in what becomes possible when translation is valued at scale, and we'll end with a concrete practical guide for leaders who want to act on this today. Of course, there are researchers, intellectuals, and cutting-edge leaders who understand this shift, but the organizational design implications haven't yet filtered through to the majority of boardrooms and hiring processes. You might be familiar with the discussion around generalists, the argument that a breadth of knowledge and adaptability are undervalued in a world that has long rewarded specialization. This episode is here to introduce a related but distinct archetype that is being discussed even less widely, the translator, also known as a bridge builder. Similar to the generalist, the translator is someone who's developed genuine depth across multiple domains. But what makes a translator specifically valuable is not just their breadth, it's their capacity to move between worlds that don't naturally speak to each other, and to create value in the spaces between them that neither world could have created alone. Personally, I consider myself a translator, a generalist trained toward innovation who stepped into rooms that weren't built to receive my perspective, and I've learned what it costs when there's no one in the room who can build the bridge. This episode is partly about giving language to something I've lived, and I suspect that some of you have lived it too. In the knowledge economy, multidisciplinary depth and expertise, paired with adaptability and the ability to synthesize across domains, consistently outperforms single domain depth when it comes to the problems that actually matter most. Individuals with multidisciplinary depth and expertise are exceedingly valuable in this economy, and roles that correspond to their unique skill set should be created wherever relevant. This is the sort of adaptation that large companies may be scared of because it's not the easiest management solution. It requires rethinking how roles are defined, how performance is measured, and how careers are structured. But I'll argue today why the benefits are so sizable that it's an adaptation worth pursuing, and why the organizations that pursue this adaptation earliest will find themselves with a structural advantage that their competitors will struggle to close. We already have research that validates this perspective. Rob Cross's organizational network analysis research shows that companies with higher internal network connectivity, meaning more cross-functional relationships and more information flowing across silos, significantly outperform those with lower connectivity on innovation metrics, employee retention, and revenue growth. It's the people who raise this level of connectivity who I'm calling translators or bridge builders. And their impact on the bottom line is real, it's measurable, and it's almost never attributed to them. Translators are individuals who move fluently between worlds that don't naturally speak to each other, across even 3 or 4 domains and teams simultaneously, serving as connective tissue rather than just a bridge between 2 points. In a typical organization, they might be the person who understands what the engineering team has built, can translate it into the commercial language the sales team needs, can frame it in the strategic terms the leadership team responds to, and can anticipate the operational questions the implementation team will raise before anyone has thought to ask them. They're not working in any of those domains exclusively, they're working in the spaces between all of them, and finding things there that none of those domains could have found alone. And I want to make an argument that goes beyond the translator specifically, because I think it points towards something important about how organizations are currently designed and what they're leaving on the table. It's in the best interest of corporations and other organizations to actively leverage these cross-domain capabilities, not just to tolerate them, but to formalize them. To give translators roles that explicitly include bridge building as a valued function, not as an unofficial extra on top of their job description. The research is clear in stating that informal role behavior, things people do naturally, driven by their particular combination of expertise, curiosity, and relational intelligence, accounts for enormous variance in team and organizational performance. And yet almost none of it appears in formal role design. I argue that we should adapt people's job descriptions as they progress through their careers to leverage their natural inclinations. The organizations that adapt to include translators' natural inclinations will have a structural advantage that compounds over time. The ones that don't will keep scheduling follow-up meeting after follow-up meeting and wonder why the gap between what is being developed and what the market demands never seems to close. Formalizing these inclinations is one of the highest leverage organizational design moves available to leaders right now. It costs almost nothing to rewrite a job description, but the return in terms of performance, retention, and organizational resilience can be extraordinary. Because the translator doesn't just translate language between domains, they enable the collaboration that wouldn't otherwise happen at all. They make the key introductions in entrepreneurial settings that change a company's trajectory. They connect the founder to the investor who is 2 degrees away, the engineer to the designer who transforms the product, the sustainability lead to the procurement director who had never thought to ask the question the sustainability lead was already trying to answer. They are, in a concrete and measurable sense, the people who raise organizational network density. And as Rob Cross's research consistently shows, network density is one of the strongest predictors of organizational performance available. Optimized collaboration is not a soft outcome, it's a bottom line outcome, and the translator is the person who makes it possible. Translators have typically developed genuine depth across a range of fields, driven by an active curiosity that most professional systems never quite know what to do with. And it's precisely this breadth of grounded expertise that's the source of their value, even though most organizational systems treat it as a liability. What makes a translator is not just the range of their knowledge, though that matters, but a specific cognitive and relational capacity. The ability to hold multiple frameworks simultaneously without collapsing them into each other, to find the common language that various professional cultures can relate in, and to build, often invisibly, often informally, often without being asked, the connections that make everything else work. They're the person who reads the room across disciplinary lines and knows which conversation needs to happen before the meeting, not in it, who sends the message that reframes a misunderstanding before it becomes a conflict. It's worth noting that translators are not a monolithic group in how they navigate this dynamic. Some translators are skilled at making their work visible. They've learned consciously or intuitively to narrate what they're doing in ways that the organization can credit and reward. They surface the connection they made, name the problem they prevented, document the bridge they built. But many translators never develop this, for understandable reasons, because making invisible work visible requires a kind of self-advocacy that can feel at odds with the collaborative, connective spirit that defines a translator in the first place. The bridge builder's instinct is often to serve the work, not to claim credit for it, and so they remain unrecognized in the function. When their contribution is absorbed into the collective outcome, their potential is never fully leveraged because nobody in a position to formalize their role ever understood what they were actually doing. So we want to highlight today that this is not a personal failing, but a collective and an environmental issue that organizations can choose to correct. In a world that's becoming ever more interdisciplinary, globalized, and complex each year, the translator is among the most important people in your organization. Let's consider an example that shows us what the bridge builders make possible and why innovation in particular is dependent upon the work of the bridge builders. Our example is a viable green hydrogen energy system, a defining technological challenge of the next decade. What does it actually take to build a green hydrogen energy system? The electrochemistry of electrolysis is at the center, yes, but surrounding it is a constellation of equally complex and interdependent challenges. The material science of proton exchange membrane degradation, the levelized cost of hydrogen production, the policy architecture of carbon markets, and the subsidy structures that determine whether green hydrogen can compete with grey hydrogen, as well as the behavioral economics of industrial energy procurement decisions made by procurement officers who answer to CFOs, not scientists. No single domain expertise solves this. The electrochemist who doesn't understand the policy environment will optimize for a solution that can't get funded under current carbon pricing mechanisms. The economist who doesn't understand the materials constraints will model an energy transition timeline that the underlying science can't support. The engineer who doesn't understand the behavioral dimension will design infrastructure that rational industrial actors operating under short-term procurement incentives won't adopt even when it's technically superior. The breakthrough, if it comes from people who can hold all of these frames simultaneously, move between them fluidly, and find in the spaces between them the insight that no single domain could have produced alone. This is the defining characteristic of knowledge economy challenges. They're irreducibly multidisciplinary, and the translator is structurally positioned to navigate them in ways that even the most accomplished single domain expert can't. Now, let's take a moment to consider the feedback loop, because it shapes our discussion from here. A feedback loop is the mechanism by which consequences of a decision travel back to inform future decisions. When the loop is short, cause and effect are visible, and learning is fast. When the loop is long, when the consequences of today's decisions only become apparent years later, organizations systematically fail to connect what they did with what resulted. And this is precisely where the translator's absence becomes most costly, because the damage done by a missing translator often only becomes visible long after the moment when it could have been prevented. When a software engineering team makes foundational architecture decisions in the first year of a product, for example, how the code base is structured or what the core data model looks like, those decisions may appear to be made purely within the engineering domain, with no obvious cross-functional dimension. But a translator in that room would be holding simultaneously the commercial roadmap, the regulatory environment, the enterprise sales pipeline, and what they know from working across teams about how the product will actually need to behave in the field. And so they'd raise a question that changes everything. For example, what happens when our largest potential clients that the sales team are already pursuing turn out to have data requirements that our current architecture can't meet? What happens if regulatory changes require us to demonstrate capabilities we haven't built for? The team will pause at this because neither scenario was in the brief. But the translator's been in enough commercial conversations to know the enterprise pipeline is coming, enough policy conversations to understand the regulatory trajectory, or has enough operational experience to see the implementation gap before it opens. This way, the architecture is redesigned in week 2, costing only 3 days of engineering time. The enterprise pivot will only arrive 4 years later. If, for example, a German financial services client with stringent data residency and segregation requirements becomes the company's largest contract. Now the product works seamlessly, without a costly rebuild, without a crisis, without years of technical debt that would otherwise have made the whole thing impossible. The outcome can exist because one person in a room 4 years earlier was holding more of the picture than their job description asked them to. David Epstein's research in Range documents this pattern empirically across fields. In complex, unpredictable domains, people who achieve the most significant breakthroughs consistently develop expertise across multiple areas before converging on a problem. His finding that Nobel laureates in science are significantly more likely than their peers to have serious engagement with arts, crafts, or performance disciplines is not a curiosity. It's evidence that cross-domain thinking is not a distraction from expertise, but a multiplier of it. Let's dive deeper. How do we actually redesign organizational role distribution to leverage what translators bring? The answer requires understanding 3 structural dynamics, not as obstacles to complain about, but as design problems to solve. Each one will point us toward a specific intervention that leaders can make. Layer 1, the Taylorist inheritance. Every job description in existence is in some sense a descendant of Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management, the early 20th century framework that emerged from the Industrial Revolution and was designed specifically to optimize factory floor production. It broke work into discrete, measurable, standardized tasks performed by workers who went deep in a single function, and built the assumption that value flows from that depth into the DNA of organizational design. The problem is that most organizations today are not factories. They're teams of humans navigating complexity, ambiguity, and interdependence. And the role structures inherited from factory optimization are increasingly mismatched to the work those humans are actually doing. The framework gave us role definitions, competency criteria, performance reviews, and career ladders that reward depth in a single defined domain. They have no instrument for measuring the translator's cross-domain contribution. Dave Winsborough and Thomas Chamorro-Premozic have documented that team role behavior, informal functions people naturally carry out in groups, accounts for more variance in team performance than formal job competencies, but almost never appears in job descriptions. The translator is the clearest example of this gap. The person whose most valuable contribution is precisely the thing nobody thought to write down. And over the last decade, this problem has intensified, as job titles and role descriptions have become increasingly standardized across industries, driven by LinkedIn's taxonomy, ATS systems that filter by keyword, and the universalization of competency frameworks across sectors. The design intervention to adapt in this respect is to rewrite at least one job description in your organization to formally include cross-domain synthesis as a competency. Not good communicator, which doesn't really capture what we're talking about, but specifically the ability to move fluently between defined domains, to synthesize perspectives that would otherwise remain siloed, and to build the informal connections that make formal collaboration possible. This changes what you hire for, what you develop, and what you signal to your organization about what is valued. Layer 2, making collective value attributable. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I notice a specific pattern here that I think is worth naming explicitly, because it sheds light on why translators are particularly likely to go unrecognized in the Dutch professional culture, and by extension in many Northern European organizational contexts. Gerd Hofstede's cultural dimensions research shows Dutch professional culture scoring high on individualism and relatively low on power distance, which creates a specific kind of meritocracy where a value is earned through demonstrable, attributable individual contribution. The system is designed to reward what can be traced back to a single person's effort and decision. The translator's contribution is almost always collective. The bridge they built doesn't have their name on it. The value they created shows up in someone else's metric. As Erin Meyer's culture map research confirms, the Netherlands operates as one of the world's most direct and low-context communication cultures. Low context meaning that subtle communication is not valued particularly, and the context within which a statement is made is often not considered. This creates a genuine preference for explicit, clear, individually attributable value that makes the translator's contextual and relational contribution structurally difficult to see. The design intervention for this pattern is to build attribution mechanisms for collective value creation, 360-degree feedback processes that specifically ask colleagues to identify who enabled their most important contributions, team retrospectives that surface the connective work that made the project possible, and performance review criteria that explicitly include cross-functional impact alongside individual outputs. The goal is to make the invisible visible, not by changing the translator, but by changing the measurement instrument. Layer 3. Designing for boundary crossing. The third dynamic goes deep into organizational psychology, and it explains something that often puzzles translators themselves: why the resistance to their contribution so often feels personal, even when it isn't. Edgar Schein's work on occupational culture shows that different professional groups develop distinct cultures with their own assumptions, values, and languages, and that these cultures are self-protective in ways their members are often not consciously aware of. When someone with a background in organizational design speaks fluent technical strategy, or when an engineer speaks fluent organizational psychology, they're crossing a boundary that each professional group uses to define itself as distinct and valuable. The boundary crossing feels like a threat to identity, not just to status. Schein calls this culture defense. The group closes ranks, questions the person's authenticity, and subtly excludes them, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Henry Taffel's social identity theory adds another dimension to this. People derive a significant part of their self-concept from their membership in professional groups, and anything that blurs those group boundaries triggers identity threat. The translator, by moving fluently between groups, implicitly challenges the distinctiveness that each group relies on for its sense of worth. They're not attacking anyone, but their very existence raises an uncomfortable question. If this person can operate in both our world and theirs, what exactly makes our world special? And Humberto Maturana's concept of structural coupling gives us the systems level explanation. Living systems, while organizations certainly behave like living systems, maintain boundaries by resisting elements that don't fit their internal logic. The translator doesn't fit the internal logic of any single group, which triggers boundary defense responses that look like dismissal or suspicion, but are actually the team doing what teams do, protecting its coherence against elements it wasn't designed to absorb. Underneath all of this sits one more dynamic worth naming, called the moat incentive. Professionals maintain their value partly by keeping their knowledge opaque to outsiders, since untranslatability is a form of job security. The translator, by making knowledge flow freely between domains, inadvertently threatens everyone's moat simultaneously, and the person who's fluent in multiple logics of value, whether industrial, market, civic, or creative logics, can read as having no fixed loyalty to any single one, which often registers as suspicious in a world that rewards deep commitment. So the design intervention here needs to operate on two levels simultaneously. At the cultural level, leaders need to actively and visibly model boundary crossing themselves, demonstrating curiosity about domains outside their own expertise, rewarding the people who bring cross-functional perspectives, and creating formal structures that make boundary crossing not just permitted, but expected. Cross-functional projects, mixed working groups, and informal knowledge-sharing sessions are not team-building exercises, they're infrastructure that makes translation possible and legitimate. And at the incentive level, create structures that reward knowledge sharing and cross-domain teaching rather than knowledge hoarding. Recognition for internal teaching and mentoring, promotion criteria that include cross-functional impact, and leadership development programs that explicitly value the ability to make complex domain knowledge legible to non-experts. The time of the open source knowledge economy is here, and the goal is to make translating one's own knowledge a career asset rather than a career risk. The Human Genome Project gives us a case study of innovation that wouldn't have been possible without translators acting within the team. An example at perhaps the highest level of consequence, the Human Genome Project is, among other things, one of history's greatest translator achievements. When the project launched in 1990, the ambition was staggering: to map the entire human genome, 3 billion base pairs within 15 years. The technical challenge was immense, but the translation challenge was arguably larger, because the project required genuine collaboration across domains that had never worked together at this scale. molecular biology, computer science, mathematics, ethics, policy, and public communication, each with its own language, its own culture, its own logic of value, and its own reason to protect its untranslatability. The project succeeded, and it succeeded ahead of schedule, not only because of the domain experts who were extraordinary, but because of the people who could move between those worlds with fluency and credibility. Francis Collins, who led the public project from 1993, is the most visible example of this. A geneticist who could testify before Congress in the morning, brief the president in the afternoon, speak to computer scientists about algorithmic approaches to sequencing, and communicate to the public about the ethical implications of what was being discovered, all with equal fluency and equal credibility in each room. Collins was not the most technically specialized person on the project, he was the most translationally fluent. And the acceleration that happened in the late 1990s, the famous race between the public project and Craig Venter's private Celera Genomics, was won not primarily through technical superiority, but through superior information flow across disciplinary boundaries. The public project's ability to move insights rapidly between its distributed teams across the boundaries of biology and computing and policy compressed what would have been decades of sequential work into years of parallel progress. The translators on the team made this possible, and most of them don't have a Wikipedia page. So what does all of this mean practically, for you as a leader right now? The first and most important thing you can do is map your informal network. And I really mean this as a written exercise. Organizational network analysis gives you a methodology for making the invisible visible. Instead of looking at your org chart, you ask your team 3 questions. Who do you go to for information when you need to get something done? Who do you go to for advice when you face a difficult question? And who gives you energy rather than draining it? Map the answers and you'll find your translators. Not because they appear at the top of any hierarchy, but because they appear at the intersection of clusters that have no other connection. They're the nodes through whom information, trust, and collaboration flow between groups that would otherwise have no bridge. Find that person. Name what they do. Make it count in how you evaluate, develop, and reward them, because right now it probably doesn't. And pay attention to who people go to in the corridors and in the informal messages, not just in the meetings, because that's where the translation actually happens. The second thing you can do is to redesign at least one job description to include translation as a formal competency. Don't write good communicator, which just gestures in the right direction without arriving there, but write specifically the ability to move fluently between domain A and domain B, synthesize perspectives that would otherwise remain siloed, and build informal connections that make formal collaborations possible. Making this explicit changes what you hire for, what you develop, and what you signal to your organization about what is valued. Your third possible action is to build the conditions in which translation can actually happen. Because the bridge builder can only function if the culture permits boundary crossing. Cross-functional projects, mixed working groups, informal knowledge sharing sessions are infrastructure. The translator doesn't need a new title as much as they require a culture that makes their natural work visible and legitimate. And your fourth, perhaps most important possible action is to protect your translators from the pressure to move them along the conveyor belt of standardized roles toward a specialized seniority title that doesn't capture their unique talents and removes them from the boundary space where their value truly lives. Their scope is their value. The instinct to develop someone by narrowing them is understandable from the Taylorist framework. But for the bridge builder, narrowing is not development, it's elimination. The organizations that recognize this early and build the systems to find and retain their translators before they leave for somewhere that can see them will have a structural advantage that compounds over time. The organizations that don't will keep scheduling follow-up meeting after follow-up meeting, wondering why the gap between what they build and what the market understands never seems to close. I want to close with 2 questions, one for the leaders who are listening and one for the translators. To the leaders, Think about the last time something in your organization that should have worked didn't. A product that couldn't find its market, a strategy that couldn't get traction, a collaboration that kept breaking down despite everyone's good intentions. Was there a bridge builder missing here? Was there someone in the team already who could have built the bridge? Who perhaps tried in an informal conversation or chat message or a quiet observation in a meeting, and wasn't heard, wasn't empowered, or eventually stopped trying? Because the cost of the missing translator rarely shows up in a single line item, it shows up in the accumulated friction of things that almost worked, in the potential that stayed potential, in the person who left quietly and took their particular kind of intelligence with them. To the translators, if you've been listening to this episode and recognizing yourself in the belonging paradox, in the code switching tax, in the frustration of seeing further than the room is currently looking, I want to say something directly to you. The fact that an organization doesn't have a job description for what you do is not evidence that what you do isn't valuable. It's evidence that they haven't caught up yet. Your value is real and it's structural. In the open source knowledge economy that's on its way, which is more complex, more interdisciplinary, more in need of people who can move fluently across domains and hold multiple frameworks simultaneously without collapsing them, your value will be increasingly impossible to ignore. The most important person in the room is often the one who makes everyone else in the room more effective. We just haven't learned to see them yet. And this episode is our contribution toward that. Thank you for listening to our 4th episode of On Emergence. I hope you found it helpful. And if you found this episode interesting, you will also be interested in our future episode on conflict as information. In this episode, we explore how conflict can become a supportive moment of insight to you as a leader. Conflict is one of the most data-rich signals a system produces. And in this episode, we reframe conflict not as a failure of communication or culture, but as information about misaligned values, unspoken power dynamics, and systemic tensions that haven't yet found another way to surface. The leader who learns to read conflict rather than manage it away gains access to a feedback loop that most organizations have systematically disabled. See you then in our next episode.